Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another player ranking for a recently finished Big Brother season, and here I'll be doing my player ranking for Big Brother 26, where obviously like my other rankings, I'll be running through every player of the cast, ranking them based on how I feel like they played on this season. And not an assessment of them as players in the grand scheme of things, as there would be probably some changes here. Anyway, we have 16 players to rank. Let's get started. At number 16, the person I think played worst on this season ends up being Lisa. And I think there's a bit of a debate here for the bottom two for me, where I think Lisa and the next person we'll be talking about are both very bad players, potentially all-time bad players. To where, considering that fact, again, when questioning which one is worse, I think there's arguments for both. I think when looking at Lisa, she's someone that was a social outcast from the very beginning. No one really wanted to work with her on the offset, where again, she was just this easy person to put on the block, was very expendable, to where while she wasn't even the target initially when on the block, she does end up having conversations, one-on-ones with everybody in the lead up to the veto competition, which again, I do like that she's actually proactive in the game at that point. However, her doing that actually puts a bigger bullseye on her back. People now thinking that she's very schemy and doing things behind people's backs, and again, that is bad. However, obviously she wins the veto, saves herself, only to still be blindsided by the end of the week, where, again, it's not even a spot where, like, she was, like, really wanting Matt to stay. It was more so just a spot where, like, no one cared enough to talk to her, to tell her to vote, to where, and she ends up being blindsided when Matt ends up going home, and proceeds to just be the easy target for the following week, and once again going on the block. At that point, being an easy target, though, again, isn't the target the entire week, where there's a point where Angela becomes the target because it's Angela, which again had nothing to do with what Lisa actively did, though again, the target ends up falling back on her, really due to this paranoia that she might have a power, which she didn't, which again, I think the fact that she wasn't able to get people to believe that she didn't have the power is also really bad from her point of view, though I could see how people can look at that as a bit of a wonky circumstance. And I think an argument for Lisa is the fact that by the end of the week, she actually had people wanting to work with her. Again, Leah was someone that was really building a good bond with her and wanted her to stay. She also had a good bond with T-Core, where T-Core also wanted her to stay, but at the end of the day, the votes were never really there. She was pretty much going home for the majority of the week, and the only time that she wasn't due to anything that she actively did. To where again, she was terribly socially with most people in the house. Most people did not like her, were genuinely annoyed by her, and considering again she was supposed to be the first boot, had she not won the veto there as well, I do feel like again it's very tough to really redeem Lisa here, to where for me again I think she is the worst player of the season here at number 16. Number 15, moving on to, again, I debated this quite a bit, but we got the first boot of the season, we got Matt. And again, I think Matt is also an all-time bad player. Matt is a person who, despite being the type of player that just does well on Big Brother, just the type of person that, again, ends up in the majority alliance, ends up with the showmans, ends up winning a lot of comps. Again, he is the type of person that you would think would do well in Big Brother, and despite that, he ends up doing really bad in Big Brother. Again, isolating himself alongside MJ and Leah in week 1, where they become massive targets. Also, openly targeting the first HOH. For a while, yes, Angela did a lot of bad work with Matt to make him do that to begin with. I do also think that Matt proceeding to, again, just openly target her, essentially making the storage room into his own HOH room, where people were going in and out, and he would campaign against Angela within it. Again, all that is so bad. Now, again, there are redeeming factors in the fact that, again, he had allies, the likes of MJ and Leah. He also was not the initial target, to where despite the fact that Angela knew this, she actually was not going to target him initially. Mind you, part of that was due to the worry that he would win a competition and save himself. But again, at the end of the day, that is an aspect of Big Brother, and I do think Matt is someone that on most given seasons, people probably wouldn't target right away. And also in general, I do think the AI arena is something that actually benefited him that as well, where again, with the AI arena, there's another chance to save himself. But I do also think that in most given seasons, I don't think there is an Angela to target Matt in the first week, where despite the fact that people were like wanting Matt out, I don't think anyone actually takes the shot in week 1 here outside of Angela. And even then, she didn't even really want to, but they're constantly shifting her mind and again, initially trying to make a deal with Matt. And again, Matt plays that terribly as well, with him telling Angela that he's not going to promise her safety next week, which is like, why? But again, I think Matt is an all-time bad player. However, again, in comparison to Matt and Lisa, I think Lisa, again, was the target for week 1. Had she not won the veto, where Matt, again, only gets put up after the veto is used. Along with the fact that, again, Lisa just goes out again the following week, where had Lisa survived another round, or even if she had, like, again, been involved in some alliances, I would have put Lisa above Matt. However, I think it's the fact that Lisa just never got any footing in the game at any single point, never had any true allies, where, again, at least Matt did. And again, I think they both had, like, really bad, like, active play, to where I think it is very marginal difference between the two. However, I did end up going with Matt here, number 15. Now, number 14, moving on to a player that I've seen some people say this is the worst player of the season. This is one of the worst players of all time. I actually don't think that's the case, but again, we'll talk about it. That person's Kenny. Where I think a lot of obviously the talk about why Kenny is like an all-time bad player is because Kenny wanted to quit. And yes, that is obviously very bad. As obviously if he is going to do this on every single season, then yes, he will never have a chance at ever doing anything in the game. However, despite him constantly wanting to quit, he actually wasn't the worst player in the world. Where, yes, he was going to be the target week 1 initially, though again, that shifts onto Lisa, people not looking at Kenny as a threat. Also beyond that, Kenny, obviously is just perpetual pawn, though again, that was due to his own doing. Where, again, just naturally, I don't think Kenny is that big of a target for most people. Where, yes, I do think he had like some questionable views on the game. It did get out that, again, like Brooklyn knew that Kenny was coming after her, and again, that's not great. But so really, like in comparison to the likes of Lisa and Matt, people at least liked Kenny. To where, again, I think the reaction to Lisa and Matt going out in comparison to the way that Kenny goes out, I think was vastly different. You very much tell how much people genuinely liked Kenny for the most part. And again, despite the fact that he was constantly wanting to quit the game, he actually still does, again, form an alliance in week 3. And while he wasn't a major orchestrator of it, he was still involved in this plan to backdoor Quinn. Again, ultimately it doesn't go through, but it did feel like he was getting like some traction in the game. To where, again, had Kenny not wanted to quit and not volunteered himself for the block, he more likely doesn't go up in week 3. As again, he was pretty close to Cedric. And I do think he would have been a player with a modicum of potential. Now, at the end of the day, he's still a bad player. I'm not saying he is a good player, but I do think in comparison to the likes of Lisa and Matt, I think he at least had more potential on this season, particularly by the time he leaves, though, again, all that is squandered by the fact that he wanted to quit the game. But again, if he didn't want to quit and didn't tell people to vote him out, I think people actually would have wanted to potentially work with him and take him, again, at least deeper into the game to where, again, I think he's at least better than Matt and Lisa. So again, I have him at number 14. Now, number 13, moving on to a player that made it a bit deeper into the game, but is also really bad, despite them, again, having some potential at points. That person is Tucker. And again, Tucker is a really bad player of Big Brother. I mean, he is someone that, again, is naturally skilled for Big Brother, and the fact that he is very good at competitions. Obviously he's going to win a lot of comps as he does on this season. He also does have this charisma to him where people do like him. I knew a lot of that's because they have crushes on him, but again, he was able to essentially cultivate this group around him where, again, that's something. Now again, what he does with that, really bad. As while he is, again, a very active strategic player, he is a very bad strategic player. Though, again, because of his activeness, I think it was able to actually gain him some control in this game in particular, where, again, we had so many passive players, where, again, I do think the target on Lisa, particularly by the time she actually ends up going out, I think was largely painted there by Tucker. Though, again, it's also a spot where he volunteers himself for the block. And again, that's just really Tucker in general. So many bad moves across the season, constantly nominating himself, putting himself in danger. Again, his move to take out Quinn in week 3 was just really dumb, where it doesn't benefit his game really at all to do so, especially because Quinn wanted to work with him at that point in the game. Is pretty much dead to rights for a lot of the game, had he not won specific comps. Though, by the time of week 5, again, when he is HOH, he does actually, again, build a group around him, a group that did seem to be a majority group. And again, by that point, he had a final 2 of Joseph that Joseph was actually loyal to by that point. He had an alliance with Angela, who was loyal at that point, but it's Angela. Obviously, he had connections with T-Core and Kimo, with Kimo in particular being really loyal to him. Obviously, had the showmans with Rina. Also had Leah and MJ wanting to work with him at that point, though, again, he burns that himself, to where, again, that's another issue. And in general, again, like, as good as Tucker is at, again, having these people have crushes on him and want to work with him, and again, having their loyalty at this point in the game, he also is someone that is actually bad socially, to where he actually does piss people off, turn them away from him, to where, again, that's another issue there. And obviously his boot week is one where, again, he did it to himself. He got himself nominated, proceeded to throw temper tantrums when he didn't get his way, and also made it like so obvious that he was targeting Leah, to where that made Leah go against him, and stopped managing MJ, and even, again, did work to push out Rina by questioning their relationship. And again, he just does so much bad. Like, Tucker is a really bad player. I do think there is some level of potential with him. I think he is just too frantic of a strategic player, while also just so questionable socially at points, to where, in the grand scheme of things, I think he is a really bad player of Big Brother. So while I do think he likely wins if he gets to the end, he was still booted at the final 11, so it's not like he was that close. Even though, to be fair, I think if they didn't take him out relatively soon, he would have been a spot where he could have potentially won out, especially considering his other allies around him. Where, again, I do think the likes of Joseph, Rina, and even Kimo would not have been willing to take a shot at him in the near future, to where, again, I think he kind of gets sniped out of the game, but again, his gameplay around that's so bad anyway, to where, again, he's here at number 13. Now number 12, and I think this is actually one of the more difficult spots on the list for me, where I very much contemplated this, because I think there definitely are arguments this person should be higher, especially considering the fact that they make it a lot further into the game. However, the more and more I thought about it, the more I just couldn't do it. And at number 12, I do have Angela. And again, Angela is a player that by the end of her run, I think she showed some ability to think about the game optimally to a degree. And she was someone that, had she gotten power at points, I think she would have been willing to make these big moves. However, she's also a really terrible player. And again, she had obviously the first HOH, a position where, again, she should have been able to set up this power structure around her and proceed to even be approached to join a majority alliance that, had she joined it, again, she probably would have been set for a good chunk of the game. Instead, she pushes that alliance away, thinking it was all a ploy. And that's really just the epitome of Angela's game. The fact that, again, she is just so paranoid and is pretty much never trusting of really anybody, to the point where it just gets her in trouble over and over and over again. Again, she should have been in a very good spot for week 1. She pushes away this majority alliance and ends up being a very easy nominee for pretty much everybody following this. So while she did eventually get her target out in Matt, she also burned Matt to begin with, where, again, her open comments about how Matt is a threat made him target her to begin with. Where also beyond that, she also ends up doing so in such a sloppy way to where she actually initially wasn't going to do Matt, and eventually did so kind of against her initial instincts anyway. Week 2, she is nominated. While initially not as the target, she eventually puts the target onto herself by calling out Cam, Chelsea, Cedric, and T-Core for working together, which ends up leading to this big spiral that has Chelsea just wanting to target her by the end, where while that eventually shifts, again, it has nothing to do with what Angela actually did right. It was more so because of Tucker pushing to get rid of Lisa. Again, week 3, once again, an easy nominee on the block. Again, was never going home because Kenny wanted to quit, and beyond that, again, there were other targets after that, but still very expendable at that point. Gets the veto used on her due to nothing that she actually does in the game, simply because of these things happening around her. Week 4, she wins the HOH, though obviously gets taken over by Deepfake. And to be fair, if she actually didn't, I actually think she would have been willing to make a pretty big move at that point. I do think she probably would have targeted Brooklyn, would have put Quinn on the block, probably alongside the likes of Chelsea or Cedric, to where, again, it probably would have been a big move anyway, to where, again, at least like minor credit there. And by this point had solidified her relationship with Tucker, to where, again, it puts her in a bit of a better standing in the game. And it takes us to week 5, where actually she's in a quote-unquote majority alliance, kind of being in the tanks and being 6th Avenue, to where, again, that's a point where at least she had something going for her in the game, even though, again, she still had no win equity. People did not respect her. No one really wanted to take her that deep, even people within her alliance. But again, she at least had an alliance. And what do you know, week 6, she turns away that alliance, obviously targeting Tucker, which, again, stemmed from her own paranoia that he was closer to Rubina, when in reality he was even planning on going to the end of Rubina either. But again, just putting a big bullseye in her back, gets herself to be renommed in that spot, in a spot where, again, she was supposed to be the target at that point, from T-Core's point of view at least. But again, gets saved due to pretty much nothing that she actively did. Again, Chelsea really flipped the vote independently of her and just kind of assumed that she would be on board if they needed her vote, which they didn't end up because she didn't win the AI arena. But either way, week 7, once again on the bottom, on the block. Quinn is targeting her during that week. Though, again, she does build a good bond with Leah. That's something. Leah uses the veto on her. So, again, I think you can give her some credit there. Again, following week, once again, used as a pawn. Again, was also, once again, initially the target. That, again, gets shifted off her because she's not a threat. And eventually gets the veto used on her. In a spot where, again, she does do work to make that happen. Mind you, kind of sloppy work where, again, she thinks that Quinn and Leah are now working with the trio and tells Chelsea that. And Chelsea does initially believe it, though realizes she's BSing her by the end, though, again, still decides to make the move anyway. Again, it's like, I guess you could say Angela did the work to move that vote forward, though, again, not really that intentionally. And we get to Janky week where, again, she seemed to be on the rise. I mean, she won a veto, used it to save Kimo, took out T-Core, which, again, the better move would have been Chelsea. But still, it seemed like she at least had her game, again, going in the right direction. Also built a bond with MJ that seemed like MJ was going to be loyal to until we get to next week where MJ targets her. Which, again, the fact that she was even the target during that week is ridiculous. There was no reason for MJ to go after her. And, again, just shows how expendable Angela was in the game. And again, gets saved again due to nothing that she actively did. Where, again, Leah gets renommed completely independently of her. And, again, she just gets sniped out to double. Where, again, it's a rocky game. I think it's a lot of bad. I think even the good things that she did here and there are not really that much to truly boon her by the end, with very little of it coming off effective for too long, where she always sabotages herself along the way. And really, just a player in general, I would not have faith in most given situations. I actually think this was probably one of her better case scenarios, and the fact that she even made it as deep as she did. So again, I just don't think Angela's that good of a player. Although there were sprinkles of positivity at points, I still think she's bad. She's here at number 12. Now, number 11, again, going from 6th place to 13th place, we do have Cedric. And again, I debated this straight up. I mean, Cedric and the next person we talked about are back to back on this list. I think no matter what, I kind of like attached them together to where for me it was like, is Angela above them or below them? I did contemplate above, but then again, I just feel like she was such a sloppy player that I went Cedric above him. And to be fair, Cedric is also a very sloppy player. But at the end of the day, I just felt like Angela was just so poorly positioned for most of the game, had no real control over the game, where again, I put her lower. But again, Cedric, to be fair, is also a very, very sloppy player. I mean, he is someone that, again, literally gets himself nominated the week he goes home. After a while, he gets sniped out in a very weird way, a way that, again, I don't think would happen in most given situations, and also puts himself on the block due to AI Arena. I do think if there was not AI Arena, I think he would have just outright been safe, because why would he even nominate himself at that point? He's still a person that, again, is someone that would nominate himself. And again, that is definitely very questionable. Even beyond that, his play in week 3 was very sloppy. The fact that he, buys into the backdoor Quinn plan, and while, again, he recognizes how dumb it is for him to do it and doesn't do it by the end, the fact that he agreed to it to begin with and actually did put some of the steps in motion just led to a dissolution of it, again, just being very sloppy. Again, him burning his relationship with Tucker, turning what should have been this very smooth HOH into a very rocky one. Though I will say, again, outside that, I think he played the first few weeks pretty well. Again, while he was not necessarily the best position in the game, he at least, again, was in the Pentagon. He had really strong allies in the likes of Cedric, Brooklyn, and Cam. He also had a final 2 with Quinn, even though that was never real from either end. But again, he still had pretty good relationships with people outside that, and in general was one of the most liked people in the house, to where I do fully think, again, he pretty much gets sniped out of the game. Again, he is in a spot where he only gets taken out pretty much in that position. I think it's very hard to even think of another position where he goes home, where, again, had it been MJ on the block at that point, MJ would have gone home. Even in the spot he was in, Kimo and T-Core were very hesitant on whether or not to make the move. They'll end up doing so. And even if the flip on the Pentagon eventually happened anyway, he was probably one of the better positioned people if that did happen. Where, again, the flip was always going to happen on someone like a Brooklyn or even a Cam who was not as well insulated at that point in the game. Where, again, I do think Cedric had a lot of longevity in him if he was not taken out at this specific point. But again, he's just such a sloppy player, one that, again, got himself nominated to where, while, again, at the end of the day, I think he is probably one of the better pre-jury players. But again, that's not really too much praise in the sense that, again, most pre-jury players of Big Brother are really, really bad. But I do say Cedric's one of these people that if you were to play again years down the road, I think he'd be a very dangerous player, seemingly very well-rounded, just, again, not seeming to know the game well enough to not nominate himself. But again, I do think as a whole, Cedric definitely has a lot of ability for the game, and again, gets taken out in a very wonky way, which is why I have him high enough here at number 11. Now, number 10, now we're moving on to, again, a player that I think at the end of the day, I kind of had to lump in with Cedric, where I think in comparison to Cedric, there's a lot of pros and cons that kind of level them out around the same, even though this person was much better positioned for an early game, and that person is Brooklyn. And I think Brooklyn is one of the tougher players to assess in the grand scheme of things on this cast, where I think there's a lot of talk about how Brooklyn was really running the show early on, and how her and Chelsea were in this dominant position early on in the game, which kind of, I mean, she was definitely the best position in the game early on. She was being lumped into all these alliances. Though with that said, I don't think Brooklyn did much actively to do so. Again, she is good socially. People liked her. That's a lot of the reason why she was in that spot. But I do think that is really the biggest issue with Brooklyn's game, is the fact that she is so passive of a player. She's someone that gets very complacent. She's someone that, again, didn't really do much active work to even put herself in the good position that she was in, and then didn't do anything to maintain that position. So even when talking about how well positioned she was in the game, I don't know how much of that was done actively. And beyond that, she also loses that position towards the end of her tenure, to where, well, obviously she was very much screwed over by Quinn ratting out the Pentagon, which made them bigger targets. She was also being targeted independently from that, from certain other people. Again, the likes of Angela was always going to target Brooklyn. The likes of Kenny had been very anti-Brooklyn. Tucker was a very anti-Brooklyn, to where really in the grand scheme of things, I mean, she very much reminds me of Amira, where I think my opinion of their games are pretty similar in the fact that Amira on BB24 was in a similar spot, where, again, she was in a very strong position. Amira was probably even more so kind of the leader of her alliance by the time she was taken out, though also did not manage the people on the bottom particularly well. Though despite that, had people on the outs targeting her directly, with the likes of Joseph and Turner wanting to go after Amira. And I think that's a similar spot to how Brooklyn was here, where, again, she did have good relationships with a good chunk of the house, was in a very strong position, but still had a few people in the minority directly coming for her. And while, again, you can question if that shot would have landed early on in the game, she's obviously in the spot where once things do turn around, again, obviously the Pentagon gets blindsided, Tucker wins HOH. At that point, she's pretty much a goner, especially considering I also don't feel like she faced adversity well when she was on the bottom. I think she was very sloppy and throwing T-Core and Kimo under the bus to Rina in a spot where, obviously she's going to trust T-Core and Kimo, who saved her more so than you, who just voted her out. So again, I think there are a lot of negatives here. Again, too passive, too complacent, doesn't face adversity well, also still eventually perceived as a threat. Again, I think there's a lot of negatives. That being said, I still think she's probably one of the better pre-jury players in the history of the show. I think, again, she had a lot of people wanting to work with her, was involved in a lot of alliances. Even once she's on her way out, she actually does a pretty good campaign. And I do think had it not been for Tucker being so anti-Brooklyn, I think she would have been able to flip T-Core and Kimo back to at least saving her over Cam at least. Though with that, again, she does also do really bad work with Tucker. Again, dumps his clothes, which is like, why are you doing that? So again, I think she's a sloppy player, but I think she's still probably one of the Burberry jury players, which is good enough to put her here at number 10. Now, number 9. At number 9, we're moving on to a player I do think it's a bit of a bad rap, where I think this is a player that gets kind of screwed to the degree in the way they go out, while also having some moments here and there before that, despite being somewhat delusional about their game. That person is Joseph. And again, I think Joseph is an interesting player on this season in the sense that I actually think Joseph is probably one of the better strategic thinkers on this cast. I think he's probably a person that had one of the most stable strategic minds that thought about the game in a more optimal way, though I do think he has issues that largely stem from his social game. I think socially he's pretty bad, to where outside of these like really good one-on-one connections he would build here and there from the likes of Leah, the likes of Tucker, the likes of Quinn, a lot of the other people in the house like did not particularly like him, or he would just not really try to build that many relationships with people outside of his like core group, to where I think that is really the big misstep of Joseph. Yeah, really outside that, when looking at like how he maneuvers through the game strategically, I actually think he does a pretty decent job. Again, he tries to build this big alliance early on. He tries to hold the collective together, which would have been a pretty decent spot for him. But once that group crumbles, he knows to flip over and finds himself in another majority alliance alongside the 6th Avenue. Again, he also tries to utilize the strategy of having a meat shield, which again has varying success, where he initially tries it with Matt, it fails, but then moves on to Tucker. And again, it looked like it would have worked. The problem is, again, that he thought he could beat Tucker. I don't think he could have. So again, that's a bit of an issue. Obviously, his game does also crumble towards the end, where obviously he gets blindsided when Tucker goes home, and he does get a bit too obvious with others about how close he is to Tucker, where I think there's some question marks there. And also, again, in his final week, he does try to play a bit more aggressively, socially, in the sense that he's trying to have more active conversations, but in doing so, he's just annoying the people he's having conversations with him constantly bragging about how good his game is, which is obviously really bad. But again, he really does get sniped out of the game, where he's in a spot where, yes, he does get Rina by one of his closest allies, which is very bad, but it is also a spot where he had the votes to stay for the majority of the week, despite the fact that theoretically people wanted him out. Again, the likes of MJ and Chelsea wavered so much across that week. They'll ultimately decide on keeping him until the last second, where Kimo's speech miraculously saved him. To where, again, I do think it's very unfortunate how those events end up playing out, to where I actually do think Joseph is a, again, somewhat competent player. And I think if he had a bit more social finesse, I think he could actually be a genuinely solid player. But again, it is his massive issues socially that do leave him lower on the list here, number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to probably one of the messier players of the season, but a player I think has a lot of upside, to where despite how much of a roller coaster the game ends up being, again, I do think there is still some good game ability there, and that person is Quinn. And again, Quinn, I think, is going to be remembered largely for how bad his HOHs were. Again, he had 2 HOHs. Both of them ended up in disaster, where he lost 2 of his closest allies during each of those HOHs. However, Quinn, for me, ends up essentially being the opposite of Joseph. Again, where Joseph was pretty competent strategically, but really bad socially, I think Quinn is on the opposite side of the spectrum. I think he's really bad strategically, making so many strategic blunders across the season, yet he's just so good socially. Again, people really liked him, and he really was in this spot to potentially dominate the game early on. Again, during the first 2 weeks, he was involved in a lot of alliances, being part of the Pentagon, and also having the Visionaries, and again, was working the middle, also having like a final 2 with Leah, and again, he had so many of his bases covered. The issue is that I think he plays very sloppily strategically within that. Again, he does tell Angela and Kimo about his power, that ends up leaking out. He ends up telling T-Core and Kimo about the Pentagon, which again makes them worried about going deep into the game, the collective, to where, again, those are massive holes in Quinn's game that really do destroy the game around him, in a spot where, had that collective power structure stayed together, he's probably in a spot to really just steamroll a lot of the game. Yet again, he actively sabotages that position throughout the season. Also, again, I do think the way he handles his power is just really terrible, and the fact that it's a power that is probably one of the most overpowered powers in the history of Big Brother, and instead he ends up wasting it, and instead of utilizing it to gain social capital in the game, he instead ends up putting a big bullseye on his back when people find out about it. And not to mention the fact that when he eventually gets that HOH, he ends up squandering that too. And then we go to week 5, again, when he's on the bottom, again, he started to rebuild his relationship with Tucker, and Tucker literally tells him that if you don't tell anybody that you're just a pawn, then I'll save you. And what do you know? He tells people that he's the pawn, which was all sloppy there. Now, I will say, beyond that, again, his game was kind of on an uptick after that. Again, he genuinely seemed to rebuild his bond with Tucker. He had T-Core and Kimo, again, wanting to take him deep into the game, but then obviously he does make the flip against Tucker, which again was the right call for sure. The problem is that he wins HOH following that and then completely squanders that HOH, where again, it's another spot where he had the opportunity to really take the game by the reins. He could have built a solid power structure around him. Again, him having Leah and Joseph as really solid allies, been able to pull in Angela as a theoretical number. Also, again, would have had T-Core and Kimo and Rina also by his side as well, but instead he decides to side with the people that don't have his back in the likes of Cam and MJ and Chelsea kind of, and too far, Chelsea did actually want to take him relatively deep at the game at that point, but still, again, they were very clearly the bigger threats in the game, yet he leaves them in a spot where they just snipe him the following round. Not to mention the fact that obviously that is also a week where he nominates Joseph in a spot where he really did not need to where that really ends up sinking his position in the game. Now, again, I will also give him credit for the fact that even in his eviction week, while that largely does happen due to the ramifications of how he played the previous week, I do still think he actually plays his final week decently well, where again, Chelsea and MJ very much wanted to keep him for a lot of that week, and had it not been for Cam really remaining resolute in wanting Quinn to go, I do think there's a shot Quinn actually saves himself, which would have been really insane. But still, I do think Quinn is a player, again, there are some major positives for him. Again, he is very good socially. People do very much like him. Or even in the spot where he lost that social capital after his power was exposed, he was still essentially able to regain all of that back by the time of the Tucker eviction, to where, again, I think he is a largely affable presence in the house. I think he is a player that has a lot of potential if he just wasn't such a mess strategically, but again, he was that mess strategically. Because that for me, he's here number 8. Now number 7, we have another extremely messy player, and one that I did debate a bit on being this high, even though I think the public perception of this player was very high by the time they left, but I think they're also just, again, not a good player in the grand scheme of things. That person's Leah. And again, I think Leah's also in the spot where, like, I think there is potential in Leah if she were to know the game a bit better and willing to take more risks in the game and being willing to take the shot at Chelsea when she needed to. Yeah, really outside that, Leah's game is a really big mess. And to be honest, I debated this between her and Quinn, or at least Quinn had like points in the game where he had a pretty stable position in the game. Leah never really did. I mean, looking at Leah's game, she's really on the bottom for the majority of it. She never really has any true power in the game. The one spot where she could have, she really just blew that up. She really just wasted that opportunity. To where, again, I think Leah's game on this season is actually really bad, which again, the fact that she's number 7 is really just an indictment on this cast as a whole. So again, I very much debated if Leah or Quinn should be higher, especially considering even at the point where Quinn goes home, she was actually a target over Quinn for a lot of that week. But the reason I do have Leah higher here is, I mean, one, she obviously made it further, but also I do think there's at least positions where Leah had more ability to really take the reins of the game, and realistically, again, like, she didn't, and that should definitely be something to detract from her. But again, despite her playing from the bottom for a lot of the season, she was still able to pull over these allies to her side at a point, to the point where, again, by the time of final 10, it seemed like she was in a position to really lead this like simp army around her. Also having Angela as a number that, again, could have put her in this very powerful position moving forward, though again, she wasted that opportunity. And again, another spot where, again, at the final 8, again, she could have made this big move, putting up T-Core and Chelsea and sniping Chelsea out of the game, something she even talked about doing previously, though again, backed out of it by the end, where again, it is kind of this weird game for me in the sense that she had these opportunities to make these big, bold plays that would have very much bettered her position. I mean, to be fair, in the final 8 spot, I think she still would have been in a bad spot even after that week, but definitely a better spot than what she ended up being in. But again, I think especially at the final 10, though, again, she very much could have taken the reins of the game, though again, just did not get Quinn to not put up Joseph, which is an issue there. And really in general, again, when we're looking at the issues with her game, there's a lot. Again, like early on, she's on the outs instantly when Matt goes home, and despite the fact that she has a whole bunch of people actually wanting to pull her in as a number, she ends up kind of turning those people away in week 2, kind of becoming more obsessed with her crush on Tucker. And also we have like the entire showmance with Cam that puts a bullseye on her back. Though again, I think something to definitely give Leah credit for, though, is the fact that she is a very self-interested player. In a house where people were constantly being willing to nominate themselves, at least Leah, again, had the foresight to not do that, and again, made active strides to get Cam to nominate himself, which again, even that's a bit questionable if she should want Cam to nominate himself. But again, the fact that she was able to get other people to volunteer in spots where, again, she would have been the more natural nominee, I think is, again, at least decent, I guess. But again, she was in on some pretty big votes. Again, she was in on both the Cedric and the Tucker votes. I think that's something to give her some credit for as well. And even in her boot round, again, it took a lot of convincing of MJ to end up making the move to where, while again, I think you still criticize her for having someone that she was fully loyal to end up being the one to take her out of the game. Again, that is still very bad from Leah's end. I think it is still, again, in a spot where she almost got out of that round. And if MJ just had a conversation with Leah pre-veto ceremony, I think Leah probably does end up staying. And even despite that, again, despite being in a spot where she should have been dead in the water, she actually does convince MJ to actually fight for her to stay and gets Chelsea to somewhat question the decision at a point to where, again, I think that's at least good work. To where, again, Leah, again, I think is a bad player in the grand scheme of things. I think she actively sabotaged her game so many times. And also had these massive opportunities that she simply did not take. But again, I think there were moments of her doing some decent things. And again, at least played self-interestedly, which on this season is enough to put her here at number 7. Now number 6, and how was this person number 6? But at number 6, I have Rina. And again, the fact that Rina is this high is more so an indication of how bad the rest of this cast is. I don't think Rina is that good of a player. I don't think she played particularly well across the season. I don't think she really did that much across the season, yet she made the Final Four. She had jury votes. Don't know if she wins, but maybe? And in general, again, Rina is just a player that I just think is very passive across this season. Someone that, again, obviously works alongside T-Core and Kimo. And while I do think she probably is a little bit more active of a player than those two, where I think there are points where T-Core and Kimo would really just waffle around, like just talk about doing things, not actually doing them. I feel like Rina like enacted more conversations than Kimo and T-Core did, but not by much. And obviously she wasn't as well positioned in the game as T-Core and Kimo kind of. I mean, like her game's very rocky, where early on, again, she was not really involved in a lot of the big alliances going on. Obviously T-Core and Kimo were a lot more involved in things like the collective, and while again, she had a good relationship with them, she was not really involved in any big alliance outside of, again, like the barbershop, which wasn't real anyway. Again, I think one of her strong suits in this game is the fact that she did build such a strong bond with Kimo and T-Core, to where, again, they go out of their way to save her. Again, even though, again, I think by the time of week 4, I think she's kind of isolating herself in the game by getting too close to Tucker, making herself a good backup to Tucker. She does become a target by the time of the eviction in week 4, to where, I mean, to be fair, MJ probably goes over her, but again, I still think it's a spot where, again, Rina gets that target on her back. But again, I think her good work in building these relationships with T-Core and Kimo, along with also Quinn's own mess up, leaking the Pentagon, ends up leading to her staying. Now, again, at the end of the day, again, I think T-Core and Kimo probably do fight for her either way, but obviously this gives them more incentive to really pull off this move in this spot instead of just deciding to let her go. And really beyond that, she ends up actually being pretty well positioned in the house, where, again, that's really a lot of the reason why she's as high on the list here, is because, like, Rina actually was decently positioned in the game for a lot of the game. Again, she had these big danger spots here and there. Again, obviously week 4. Later in the game, she was always, again, the secondary target of the trio. There were points where, again, she was going home if it wasn't for things outside of her control. Obviously, just even in week 4, again, she was going home to get saved, do things that she didn't really actively do. Even against T-Core, again, initially, Rina was the target because Leah just assumed that there was no way to get T-Core out, and that ends up flipping to really nothing that Rina actively does. I do think the fact that Kimo ends up staying multiple times, again, nothing that really Rina ends up doing, ends up really benefiting her game in those spots as well. So again, I think Rina just doesn't really do that much on this season, but again, she's still like decently positioned for a lot of it. But again, it is still her really passive play that becomes so frustrating to watch on the show, where, again, I do think there is some potential there with Rina, where I think there are points where she does have the right reads on certain situations, but then just doesn't do anything about it. And again, especially in the end game, again, she realizes that Chelsea is the biggest threat in the game, that they should target Chelsea, and again, she does throw Chelsea under the bus to MJ, which, I mean, to be fair, the fact that it doesn't work, I'd probably put more on MJ in that spot. But also, like, to be fair, I don't think she really handles that conversation that well, where I don't think she really uses as much conviction as what she should have in that situation. It really just leads to her coming out of that week being looked at as this big schemer. But again, she at least tried to get the target on Chelsea. And beyond that, again, she does get into this like all women final 3 thing that, again, was real for MJ at a point. But again, I think her final round is just so damning. I mean, the fact that she, again, knows that MJ has the sole vote to evict and just doesn't talk to MJ for days following that, and doesn't campaign to her until the day before the eviction, a spot where the decision was pretty much already set by that point. And to be fair, I don't know how effective Rina's campaign was ever going to be anyway, as I do think Chelsea probably would have been able to get MJ back on board anyway. But still, the fact that, again, she just doesn't try, and like her not trying until so late into the week ends up causing MJ to become more resolute in the fact that, well, they shouldn't be keeping Rubina. And I think all that's so bad. And just in general, Rubina, I think is just such a passive player, and through that, such a frustrating player to where while there are, again, decent aspects of her game, I think she is good socially. She does build good relationships here and there. She has right reads at points. I think as a whole, not a particularly good player. And to be fair, she is higher on this list than I think I would have her in my general player ranking of every player of all time. But again, just pertaining to this specific game, I guess it's enough to put her here in number 6. And now number 5, we're moving on to a player that I really did not want to put this high. I really feel like this player is actually really bad, and I very much contemplate putting him much lower, as again, there's precedent for doing so. However, I think the one thing stopping me is presumed win equity, but we'll talk about it. At number 5, we do have MJ. And again, I think MJ plays the game almost as poorly as she could for someone that was a runner-up of her season. I think she is someone that was on the bottom the entire first half of the season. She was initially going to be a nom in week 2 until she told Chelsea about her America's veto, and through that stopped Chelsea from putting her up because she was worried about America's veto being used and one of her own allies going up. Week 3, despite her still having this power that should have been a good enough threat for anyone to stop them from putting her up, she still gets put up as the Renom to flush out her power. And even then, actually wasn't going to use it initially and only uses it because of Tucker using the veto on Angela, which is not what she was expecting. And to be fair, again, she wasn't going home, at least at the time that she was Renom, but again, that possibly could have changed by the end. Week 4, she was going home had it not been for the fact that she won the AI Arena, which again is also a luck-based circumstance. This season even had the AI Arena to begin with. As it wasn't for the AI Arena being on this season, she's probably gone in the pre-jury phase. Week 5, despite her being a vote in the Cedric eviction, she gains no capital from doing so, as she wasn't really looped into the plan, just voted that way without any guidance. And immediately after that flip happening, she decides to side with the losing side, trying to build a relationship with Chelsea and Brooklyn, who again are on the bottom at that point, in a position where the other side has the HOH. All that is also really bad. Week 6, she's once again on the block, at points to target throughout that week, though to be fair, by the end, there wasn't really a chance of her going home. Though to be fair, by the end, the only way she actually goes home is if Tucker wins AI Arena. Also, that's probably a spot where if there was no AI Arena, Tucker probably isn't the nomination there anyway. Though also, to be fair, without AI Arena, Tucker's not there to begin with anyway. But either way, I mean, that week is a little rocky, but not as rocky as week 4. I think that's the most damning one of her actually just straight up going home if there's no AI Arena. But again, she ends up being part of the Tucker move. After the Tucker move is where her game, again, gets better. And the reason why she is higher on this list is, again, she is in an actual majority group from that point on. Again, she is in this trio alongside Cam and Chelsea, and they work together throughout the rest of the game, dominate the entire game together. Though even within that, I do question her decision making at almost every single turn. Again, we get the Joseph eviction week, where she spends the entire week wavering with Chelsea on whether or not to take out Joseph, in a spot where it makes no sense for her to get rid of Joseph. For her, she should be wanting the trio out, as the trio is more likely to target her than Joseph, and also Joseph was a pretty big shield for them, where they hated Joseph and wanted Joseph out. For getting rid of Kimo was the very obvious choice for her, though she ends up contemplating making the move until she doesn't, until then she does. And again, not even based on strategy or anything, purely based on emotion, because Kimo's speech got to her, and she wouldn't be playing with morals if she got rid of Kimo. Beyond that, the following week, and she wins the veto, uses it to take out Quinn in a spot where that's also not good for a game. Quinn is again another shield for her as protecting her in the game, and by getting rid of Quinn, she now again makes it more likely that the trio ends up targeting her, where she was again having Quinn in front of her before that. And even in that spot, again, she backdoors Quinn and then proceeds to waver on that decision. Her and Chelsea go back and forth about keeping Quinn across the week, which would have been so stupid. And again, another one that, again, it's not even based on real strategy, it's mostly based on emotion because they feel bad for Quinn, but again, another point of weakness of her game. Then we get to the week that she actually plays well. I think the janky week is the only part of the game where she actively makes the correct decision for her game, flips the phone to T-Core, does a lot of the active work to do so too. Again, across that week, we see her build a relationship with Rubina, build a relationship with Angela, which she later throws away, does a lot of the campaigning with Cam, gets Cam on board, eventually gets Chelsea to get on board by the end, remains resolute in her plan. Again, I think that is the week where she plays the best, is getting rid of T-Core, again, is very good for her. The problem is that she's only doing so to get close to Chelsea, where again, the move should be getting rid of T-Core to eventually open up the ability to get rid of Chelsea down the road, where again, it's obviously you don't want Chelsea out just yet because you do have Chelsea theoretically protecting you in the game, but the point is to weaken Chelsea so that you can take out Chelsea down the road, but instead she's just doing so that Chelsea takes her to final 2. Then we get to her first HOH, which I still stand by. I think is one of the worst HOHs in BB history. Really, after seeing the jury roundtable, I think I feel even more resolute in that, and the fact that it seemed like the jury was very hung up on the fact that she took out Leah, which was such a bad bad move for her game. But really the reality is the move was already bad to begin with. Her targeting Angela is ridiculous. Actually, again, she just spent the previous week bonding with Angela. Now she's targeting Angela in a spot where Angela and Leah are both very loyal to her, to where they both are taking her deep into the game in favor of keeping around Kimo and Rina, who want to target her. And the thing is also, her nominating Angela wasn't even her being manipulated. That was just purely on her own accord. And then she makes it even worse by actually being manipulated by Chelsea and putting up Leah. But again, she comes out this week being the number one target in the double eviction. She would have gone home had Chelsea not won the HOH there. Had pretty much anyone else won the HOH there, where again, Kimo and Rina were directly targeting her. Cam was in a spot where he wanted to target her, though wasn't necessarily willing to take the shot. Though I do think in a spot where if Kimo had won the veto, and now knowing that MJ would be a guaranteed person to go home, I do think he would have taken the shot there as well. So again, it really just further emphasized how bad of a move it was to even target the Angela Leah side during her HOH. And we get the final five, where getting rid of Kimo is a fine move for her. I think the better move is getting rid of Cam. Again, that splits up Cam and Chelsea. Also getting rid of someone that is directly coming for you, while also keeping in people that are, again, are not as good at comps. Now, to be fair, again, Cam ended up not being very good, did he? But still, Cam almost beats her in the veto. I don't think Kimo is almost beating her in that veto at final four, to where, again, I think the correct call at that point is taking out Cam, and she almost did it, but for the wrong reason. She almost did it because Cam was throwing competitions, which, why do you want to target him for throwing competitions? That's ridiculous. Now, again, by the end of the week, she still puts her foot down and keeps the vote on Kimo, which obviously is the correct call for her over Rina, though there was a point where the votes did flip against Rina, which obviously would have been very bad for her. Then we get to the final four, where it is so obvious she should take Rina in the final three. It is insane for her to take Cam. Cam is someone that, again, is more likely to take Chelsea. We learned after the fact he would have taken Chelsea, while Rina is someone that would have taken MJ, told MJ she would take her. And what do you know? She votes out Rina. Because, again, she needs to play a loyal game to those that were loyal to her, because definitely Cam and Chelsea were always loyal to her and definitely didn't contemplate taking her out during the double. And then we get the final three, where obviously she makes the even dumber decision of taking out Cam over Chelsea, which seems like a game-losing move. Now, I will say, at the time of this recording, I don't fully know what would have happened in the Cam MJ final two. My assumption for most of the season was that MJ would have beaten him. And really, this placement on this list is very much determined by if that is true, where I am under the assumption that it is true. If MJ did have win equity and would have beaten, again, the likes of Cam, the likes of Rina, she does end up staying around here. If that's false, she drops significantly. Because really, for me, I think her win equity is one of the only major strong pillars of her game at this point, where everything else is so bad. Again, she needs competition wins to get to where she is, needs AI Arena, needs America's Veto, ends up still taking the wrong person at the end, losing unanimously, and does pretty much every strategic move across the game to benefit Chelsea. And the only one that she doesn't is to get closer to Chelsea. So again, I think MJ plays a truly awful runner-up game of Big Brother. I think she makes the wrong decision at every single turn. So again, the only reason she would be this high is that if she almost won the game. And with that even being up in the air at this point, again, I think if it turns out that she couldn't win this, I think she's probably like right above Angela. I think she legitimately drops towards the bottom of the list, but I think at this current point, again, I don't know what her winning odds are, and just to be safe, I will put her here at number 5, even though I do think MJ's game is god-awful. Now number 4, and at number 4, moving on to a player that had so much potential, and what do you know, didn't really utilize much of it, but still good enough to be our number 4 on this season. That person is Kimo. And again, Kimo, I just think is another one of these players that just played way too passively. Again, there were points where he was actually playing somewhat decently. Again, early on, he had this relationship with T-Core. He was brought into the collective. He had the visionaries. Quinn entrusted him with knowledge about his power. And again, I thought Kimo was actually in a pretty good spot at that point. The problem is, again, he plays too passively beyond that. Doesn't really do much actively at that point in the game, where again, there's a lot of this talk about making this alliance with the visionaries plus Tucker and Rina. And again, at that point in the game, it could have been this alliance that really ran the show, and instead they just never formalized the alliance. But again, we see him like build this relationship with Tucker and tell Tucker about the power, which again, I did not absolutely hate that move, as again, I think utilizing Quinn's secret to solidify another relationship, I think is an interesting move there. The problem is that he's doing it because he has a crush on Tucker, not because of actual game reasons. So again, that becomes frustrating. He kind of gives up in week 3 after Tucker reveals that he was the one that gave him the information about Quinn's power, where again, he doesn't really even try to do damage control following that, which was questionable. Now, week 4, I think is his best week in the season. I think it's actually probably the point where I think he actually makes a pretty good move, and that's part of the reason why he's this high on the list, because during most of his game following this is not that great. But again, I would give Kimo most of the credit for the Cedric move. I think he is the person that pushed this move the most. For a while, you can argue that it was only a move that was able to be executed because of T-Core's influence in the game. game. I do think Kimo was the one to push T-Core into wanting to make this move, where T-Core was a lot more apprehensive about making a move. And to be fair, for T-Core, I think there's an argument that this wasn't even really the right call for her, but I think for Kimo, it definitely was, considering he was much lower on the collective power structure. He didn't have those connections to the likes of Chelsea and Brooklyn. So again, I think him making the move to turn against the collective is a lot more imperative for Kimo in that spot than it is for T-Core. And again, him being the one to get T-Core to go through with this move, get the votes together, I think is definitely Kimo's best move of the entire season. And beyond that, again, even though, again, I think he kind of starts playing more passively once again, they still find themselves in all these alliances with Rina and Tucker, again, in 6th Avenue, the tanks. Again, it puts him in a pretty decent spot at that point in the game, even though his passive is kind of what puts this big bullseye on his back. Where really from this point forward, he is pretty much the primary target for his trio, where, again, if T-Core, Rina, and Kimo were to be targeted at any point, Kimo was the person that was going to be targeted. And a lot of that came from him really getting a lot of the brunt of the blame for the flip the previous round, where despite them initially being more upset at T-Core, eventually a lot of that blame goes on to Kimo, and seemingly because Tucker pretended like he was willing to put Kimo on the block, which made them, again, put more of their frustration onto Kimo with them actually thinking they could potentially get him out. But still, I do think Kimo becomes this big bullseye in the game following this, where obviously he's well enough insulated to where he's not really targeted over the likes of Tucker, which is a spot where he gets blindsided there. Again, he should have been booted next, and he was literally the target for the majority of the week. And while, again, Chelsea and MJ very much wavered throughout most of the week, it did land on him. He was going home at the final 10 until, again, he technically saves himself, mind you, miraculously, in a spot where this has never happened before in Big Brother history, of someone's final plea actually being effective. But again, it does. To where, how do you really assess that from gameplay? I don't know, but it's something he does. He does technically save himself, even though, again, he failed at pretty much everything before that at that point in the week. And even that is a position where he largely gets saved due to the fact that Quinn himself made such a dumb mistake, Joseph on the block to begin with. But beyond that, again, he's once again targeted the following round, despite the fact that it's completely against Chelsea's best interest to be doing so, only for him to be, again, benefited due to things completely out of his control, where Quinn gets backdoored, gets taken out. Following round, once again, Leah initially wants to target Kimo for no reason, in a spot where it's so dumb for her to do so. And again, he at least does some decent work in having goodish conversations with Angela to get her to use the veto on him, but even then, not particularly active work there. And even actually has to be convinced by T-Core that he should even campaign to begin with. But again, he then proceeds to try to keep T-Core in the game, despite that actually being not in his best interest at that point in the game also, as again, he loses to T-Core while he at least beats Rina at the end. So again, that was also questionable. Final 7, again, he is nominated once again. So to be fair, at that point, never really the target. And again, at least there, I will give him some credit for not being targeted, both there and at the double eviction, where, especially for the likes of Cam and MJ, I think it would have very much benefited them to get rid of Kimo at some point during those rounds. But again, eventually he does get evicted in Final 5. In a spot where, again, he does actually do some decent work that week. He does build this connection to Cam, gets Cam to want to keep him around, even though it's not even in Cam's best interest to do so. Cam does convince Chelsea at a point to keep him, and that's good. Obviously, he doesn't really lock in those votes, and that's still an issue there. But again, I think there are good aspects to Kimo's game at that point in the game, but it's just surrounded by so much passiveness, and really just him being such a big bullseye for a lot of that back half of his season, to where, again, it's really tough to assess Kimo, because, again, I think there is that potential there. Again, there's points where he recognizes what he's supposed to do, and he does fully fight for the Cedric blind side. He does recognize that Chelsea is the biggest threat and does try to get Rina to get on board of targeting Chelsea. Again, he does have these right reads at points, but it's just surrounded by, again, so much passiveness. So again, it's a very frustrating game, but I do think the fact that, again, he does pull off one of the biggest moves of the season and was also pretty decently big jury threat by the end, I think is enough to put him here at number 4. Now, number 3, moving on to one minor step better, I guess. We got T-Core. And again, T-Core is just such a weird player in the season also. Again, pretty much the same thing as Kimo, but just better position throughout the game. But again, how much of that was necessarily active? Where, again, while I do think T-Core is better positioned throughout a lot of this season, she also had more winner prospects than him on this season, where, again, I think she probably is the biggest jury threat on the board by the time she goes home. I think she's also probably a player that I have less faith in general, where, again, I think if T-Core were to come back or Kimo were to come back, I think I would have more faith in Kimo personally. I feel like Kimo knows the game better, seemed to have more of a strategic edge to him than T-Core, where I think T-Core is just a purely social player, where, again, she is very good at building these one-on-one connections, and a lot of that funnily coming from the fact that she is actually introverted. I feel like the fact that she isn't this really loud personality actually ends up helping her in building these connections. It makes people feel more connected to her, where, again, most people in the house just adored T-Core. Again, obviously she had Kimo and Rina. Again, Tucker very much liked her, even though, again, she never liked him. Again, Quinn adored T-Core. He was able to build good bonds ones with Chelsea and Brooklyn, even though, again, the Chelsea one's a little bit rocky. Because Chelsea never actually really seemed that loyal to her. But again, really had these connections with pretty much everyone in the endgame stretch, to where, again, I think that is very impressive. When looking at her game, again, it's very similar to Kimo's, though her essentially just being a step above him. Again, while they were involved in pretty much every alliance together, she was almost always better positioned in those alliances. Again, in the collective, she had much better relationships with like the Chelsea and Brooklyn that made her safer in that position. In a spot where, again, despite the fact that they flipped the vote on Cedric, which again, I mentioned before that I don't think was necessarily the right call for T-Core, a lot of it's based around the fact that T-Core is so passive in the game, where obviously if she was a more aggressive strategic player, I think that is the right call. Allows her to take control of the game, as we see her almost do immediately after that, and the fact that she, again, now has Rina, has Tucker. They were able to flip over Joseph. They have Angela. Again, they are starting to add in these numbers to their side, where, again, T-Core could have ran the show from that point forward, but again, it's just too passive a player to do so. Which is why you think, again, if she was going to be as passive a player as she is, and not making the move there, maybe would have been better for her, as again, it would have put her in a spot where Quinn was always intending on flipping on the Pentagon, where had they gotten towards the end with most of the collective members, it would have allowed Quinn to flip over. They would have also had Joseph on their side at that point still. And again, with her having connections to Chelsea and Brooklyn and even Cedric, again, it would have put her in this pretty good spot in the game, to where, and even if the Pentagon structure somehow stuck together, I do think she's the last person standing before they get down to just the Pentagon. Even then, again, they definitely would have flipped on each other by then. To where, again, I think for T-Core, it wasn't even necessarily the worst thing in the world, which I do think is definitely an impressive aspect of her positioning in the game. Again, beyond that, again, when she makes the flip, initially they are pissed off at the fact that she makes this flip, but eventually they just aren't upset at her anymore, with, again, Joseph and Kimo getting a lot more of the blame over her. Now, again, how purposely was that? Not much at all, but again, just showing how strong she is socially there. And again, obviously we got to talk about her HOH, which obviously a lot of people talk about how bad her HOH is. And straight, again, I mentioned this before in my review, I don't think the concept of her HOH is that bad. I think losing Tucker is not bad for T-Core in that spot, because again, I think Tucker is so primed to win a lot of the comps moving forward. And again, the sniping out of the game before he's able to do so is good for her, especially considering the fact that Tucker wasn't planning on going to the end with her. Again, Tucker was more loyal to the likes of Joseph and Rina, and even like probably closer to Angela, to where, again, I do think T-Core would have been like 5th or 6th on Tucker's power structure, to where, and I do think it was the right call to get rid of Tucker. Obviously, the way she does it is ideal, where I think it would have been better if she locked in a lot of these other relationships around her, was able to gain social capital through getting Tucker out, where, again, instead in this spot where, again, she essentially does it by accident, I don't feel like that's particularly great. But I do think the concept of getting rid of Tucker was not necessarily a bad call, even though, again, it's not really a call from her. Now, beyond that, again, I do think the rest of her game's a bit rocky, where obviously, again, at that point, I do think she mismanages her relationships, where still working alongside Chelsea and they were protecting each other. Again, I always felt like Chelsea was never really loyal to T-Core, would have been willing to cut her, as again, literally during the following week when Quinn is needing a Rina. Chelsea is even saying in the DR that she wants T-Core on the block to just get rid of one of the trio, which again makes no sense for Chelsea's game, but also, again, really just shows that T-Core put just way too much faith into this Chelsea relationship. And I really think by that point in the game, she really just ends up squandering a lot of her potential, where, again, the trio becomes this massive bullseye on the board, and she really mismanages Quinn, where, well, Quinn doesn't target her, and again, I guess credit for her for that. So I get, for some reason, Quinn was continuously adding her into alliances, despite the fact that he wasn't adding in Rina and Kimo, which was really dumb of him. But I think that aspect of her game is good. And again, it does allow them to get rid of Joseph, which actually puts her in a pretty good spot following that. But I once again feel like none of that was really purposeful. And same thing goes with Quinn eviction as well, where I don't think she really does anything of real substance during that week to make Quinn go out. But Quinn going out is good for a game in the sense, obviously, she has all of her trio at the final 8. And she once again gets to keep all of her trio in the Quinn eviction week, even though, again, I don't feel like she really does anything of substance there to actually get Quinn evicted. But again, that still is very beneficial for her. Though that does lead to her final week in the game, which again was just riddled with passive, and really just in general, obviously her entire game is riddled with passiveness, where she would constantly talk about doing something but never really doing it. Again, obviously one of the big frustrations is her handling of the relationship with Quinn, where a lot of it disintegrates just because she didn't bother to manage it, and again got upset at him for keeping Leah safe, despite the fact that she never told him anything that would make him want to target Leah. But either way, her final week ends up being one where, again, I do think she is kind of sniped out of the game, where I do think Leah and Angela are the only two people that would have targeted her. I think that's really the only way that T-Core ever goes out in that spot, where even then, even the way that she does go out is kind of flimsy, where again, she ends up really avoiding a lot of her worst case scenarios, and that where again originally Leah talked about Chelsea T-Core noms, which would have been bad for her but not completely detrimental if they voted out Chelsea. But beyond that, obviously they end up targeting Kimo and Rina, which is obviously very bad for T-Core, where while she's personally safe, it's obviously targeting one of her own members, which obviously just empowers Chelsea and weakens T-Core. But then obviously the worst of it comes from the fact that she's obviously the back door during this week. And to be fair, like her campaign is kind of one that's a little bit questionable, where, I mean, she obviously does lose out on the vote there. And again, is very passive in her overall campaigning style, though. I do feel like she actually does decent work in pulling Cam back over, where Cam is initially convinced to take out T-Core, and T-Core's able to convince him back to her side, and talking about how Leah's making up lies about her, which weren't lies. But again, like, I think she does like decent work there, but obviously it's not enough by the end. So again, I think it's just a tough game for T-Core, where I think obviously there's a lot of good, especially socially and position-wise, but I think her really lack of agency in terms of her strategic game is obviously very damning to her game as a whole. Now again, she is a very likely winner if she gets to the end, and had, again, Leah done her initial plan and targeted Chelsea, and Chelsea had gone out during that week, I think that does put T-Core in a pretty powerful position following that, especially if her side's able to start winning competitions, which probably not, but still. Again, her alliance at that point would have been almost half of the people left in the game, and that would have been a pretty crushing position for T-Core, especially considering the fact that she would win against pretty much anybody. But again, obviously, I think the issue is the fact that I wouldn't have faith in her to really do much with that, considering, again, she's just so passive outside that. And again, she's number 3 on this list, and again, a lot of that really just stems from the fact that, again, most of this cast is really bad, where I do think T-Core is a deeply flawed player. I think her, again, social ability is very good, but I think pretty much everything else outside that is not particularly good. But again, on a cast that essentially has one really good player, then one kind of like baseline player, and then like everyone else is just so deeply flawed, I think it does lead to T-Core, despite all of her flaws, still somehow landing here at number 3. Now number 2, and for me it was an easy number 2. I don't even think it's that close. I think this is by a decent margin. At number 2, I do have Cam. And again, I know some people that really dispel Cam's game, and I will say I do think Cam is by far the second best player of the season. I think he is a player that, while again, very flawed still, again, would have taken Chelsea to the end in a spot where he would have lost to her, seemed to kind of give up towards the end of the game, also didn't really campaign for himself in a spot where he was on the block back in week 5. Again, those things are very bad. However, outside that, his game is very stable. His game is just simply get in a majority, stay in the majority, have some influence within that majority, and just build good relationships outside that. And if you just add in comp wins to that, most of the time that's enough to win Big Brother. Now, I do think a lot of that starts in the back half of the season, though in the first half in itself, again, he is well positioned. He is part of the collective. He's part of the core. He's part of the Pentagon. He has the Andersons. He has the barbershop. He has a lot of these different groups that he's a part of, with no one really targeting him, and most people really liking him. So again, I think he starts off the game very well. Though I will say, I do think that his game does go downhill for the rest of the pre-jury phase. Again, week 2, Chelsea contemplates putting him up as a pawn. He initially fights back, though does end up giving into it, which is, again, really bad there, as again, it would have put him in potential danger. Week 3, he gets like really on board of this Quinn backdoor plan, which was, again, not good for him. But again, it doesn't go through. Week 4, he obviously ends up being on the outs there when Cedric ends up going home. Week 5, he would have gone home had Brooklyn won AI Arena. Mind you, that's the only scenario he goes home, to where it's not like MJ, who is going out in most scenarios. And also different to MJ, I don't think Cam is even on the block if there is an AI Arena, where MJ would have been a target either way. Without AI Arena, I don't think Cam is nominated. I think it is Brooklyn, Quinn noms. Quinn taking off the block, put up Chelsea. I don't think Cam is even on the block if there aren't 3 noms, to where I think that's something else to make that situation a little bit better. And obviously beyond that, again, his game does turn around. Again, week 6, he starts to build this bond with MJ. Him and Chelsea agree to add in MJ as part of their trio. They end up agreeing to vote out Tucker. Now, obviously, again, I give Chelsea a lot more of the credit for that move, but still, I don't think that move goes through without Cam agreeing with Chelsea that they need to make this move to take out Tucker at that point, which kickstarted Chelsea going around the house to campaign for the vote. The Joseph week is where, again, it gets a bit rocky. Now, that again, the Joseph week's a bit rocky as well, where, to be fair, I mean, he's still within the majority group. The thing is that, again, Chelsea and MJ kept on wavering on what decision to make, and ended up making a very emotional decision by the end and flipping their vote based on Kimo's speech, to which Cam is left out of that, though again, he was technically playing for his best interest at that point, taking out Kimo, which I do think is the right call for him. But then I think his game does kickstart a bit when we get to the Quinn eviction week. Again, I do think that while, again, Quinn's eviction doesn't necessarily actually benefit him that much, which is the questionable part of it, where, again, I think he, like MJ, I think benefits a lot more from losing a member of the trio that week. Quinn is a shield for him. I do still think it's a spot where Cam does demonstrate a lot of influence across that week. So again, he ends up being very gung-ho about wanting Quinn out, where him and MJ are the ones to convince Chelsea to go for Quinn over Leah, which at least in that debate, I do think it is better for him to get rid of Quinn over Leah, even though, again, should have gotten rid of one of the trio. But once that move is made, again, we do see MJ and Chelsea really wavering on the decision, constantly going back and forth on whether or not to do it, where we see Cam, again, stay steadfast, never change on the decision, get Chelsea back on board. And again, I think that's something you do have to give Cam credit for. Next week, again, he ends up being the swing vote in that position. And again, I think he makes the right move for his game. And him actually having a relationship with Rina at that point, where by this point, again, there was some worry that he was going to go to the end of Chelsea and T-Core, which would have been really stupid, as he did mention that at some point in the past. Though again, with him being willing to cut T-Core here, goes along NJ. Again, I think that is the right call for him, even though, again, he does waver across that week to where I think that is definitely a criticism there. But again, week 7, when Leah goes home, he does have a lot of influence with MJ across that week, where after MJ does the initial manipulation and trying to get her on board with Leah, it really is Cam that really locks that in, that puts in a lot of work to take Leah out. And beyond that, again, we do see him immediately proceed to flip on MJ and want to take out MJ during the double. Now, again, I don't think he himself been willing to do it unless kind of forced to, though I think with the video results we got, I do think he probably makes the move by the end. But again, didn't matter because he didn't win comps. And really, again, just in general, his inability to win comps is seemingly a major reason why people dispel his game. Where obviously a lot of people assumed he was going to win a lot of comps. I did too, as again, he was my winner pick of the season. Due to that notion, yeah. Obviously, with the more equitable comps, again, he very much struggles in a lot of competitions, which I do think alters his perception in the game. And again, I think makes people think he's a worse player than what he actually is. But again, at the final 5, we do see him almost get targeted due to him throwing competitions. But again, we once again see Cam do pretty good work convincing MJ that he wasn't throwing competitions, to which he ends up being convinced to keep him around, which obviously, again, Chelsea did put in the groundwork, but I do think Cam really locked that in by the end, where she came in that conversation still unsure of what she was doing and then leaves by going to Chelsea and says, yeah, we're keeping Cam around. And then follows that up with almost flipping the vote to save Kimo. Now, again, you can question if that's the right call, as again, I do think Kimo beats him at the end more handily than Rina, where again, I don't think that's the right call for his game, but he almost pulls it off. He does convince Chelsea to do so. Though the votes were there until just hours before the actual eviction where he seemingly flipped. So again, I would give him credit there as well. And again, that is a move that he actively does on his own. Again, a spot where people say he does nothing. He did legitimately almost pull off a flip single-handedly there. Then we get the final 4 where once again, he should be voted out there. It is idiotic for MJ to not vote him out. And what do you know? She doesn't vote him out. And again, Chelsea obviously had a factor into that. But again, Cam also does very good campaigning. Implies there that he's willing to cut Chelsea, which he wasn't, which again, we'll talk about. Again, he does end up manipulating MJ there to keep him around, which I do think is good on his end. And we get to the final round where, again, he gives up by the end. I mean, once he doesn't win part 2, he does essentially become willing to be voted out and all that. Not great. And obviously, again, we do learn post-show that if he had won, he would have taken Chelsea to the end. That's also very bad as well. But again, I think when we're looking at the rest of this cast, this rest of this cast is just so bad. To where, again, I think Cam is a very average player across Big Brother history. Not necessarily average in terms of like right in the middle of ranking every player, but more so average in the sense that I think his pros and cons just kind of equal out. Again, he's not a particularly good Big Brother player, but he's not an actively bad Big Brother player either. And again, on a cast like this, where we have so many actively bad players, so many extremely passive players that do very little in the entire game, I feel like for Cam, someone who is stably in a majority group for the back half of the season, does, again, a lot of good work to save himself at points and also has some minor influence at points, while also being very well liked by the entire cast. For me, that is enough to put Cam here in number 2. Now, number 1 player, BB26, is unsurprisingly Chelsea. Again, it's not close. I mean, this is by a pretty wide margin. I mean, even though, I think Cam is number 2 by a wide margin, Chelsea's number 1 by an even wider margin. Again, Chelsea, through her win, which is one of the most dominant wins in the history of Big Brother, I think is, again, up there as a potential top 10 player. She is very close to it for me personally. I haven't fully decided on where exactly I land her, but again, I do think she is a very dominant player of the show, but also a very flawed one, which is what makes her placement for me a bit rocky, where, again, running through a game where, again, initially she's disadvantaged in a spot where, again, that should be dead men walking at that point. Again, many times in the past, had this happen, I do feel like people just gang up on the 2 people with disadvantages and take them out of the game, yet she's able to escape that. Now, again, how much of that is based around the cast, who knows? But really just in general, the entire notion of that it could only be done with this specific cast and that she had a cast of really dumb players is just an argument that doesn't really hold much weight in the grand scheme of things, just because like every cast is just so variant, where really utilize the cast as this way to discredit someone's entire game, I think is very disingenuous. Though it did seem like initially on the offset, there was this like house decision to keep these people safe, which again helps her gain a lot of social capital through that first week. It allows her to really get in with everybody, but not really take a stand to the point where people are upset over where she ends up voting. To where, again, I think she ends up playing that first week very well. Again, ends up being in a lot of alliances. Again, the core, the collective, the Pentagon, very well insulated there, and proceeds to win HOH the following week in a spot where her HOH is mostly good. I think by the end, again, she takes out Lisa. I think that's a good move for her game. Doesn't really lose her any standing in the game, though at the same time, she does initially waver on potentially putting up Cam as a pawn, which she almost goes through this. She was actually going to do so until she goes to the diary room to make her nominations, which again would have been very idiotic, though thankfully she doesn't do that. Beyond that, this is also a week where she starts to show her jealousy for Cam in a spot where, again, it became very strange, and I do think it impacted her game at points, though we'll talk about that. And also, this is a spot where she should have started to cultivate her relationship with MJ, where MJ shows her the America's veto, and through that, again, it seemed like she had MJ in her pocket, only for her to just not do anything with it, which I think becomes one of her major issues through the early portions of her game. But week 3, again, not really much to say. She's kind of in the same position. She does really fight to save Quinn, which again is the right call for her game. Week 4 is where, again, she loses control of the game. The vote flips against her. And I do think she takes a lot of the blame for that, for me personally. I do think, again, there's only one vote difference in a spot where she could have very easily pulled over MJ, because MJ, again, was not really part of the plan. No one even locked in with her to vote in Cedric, to where had Chelsea gone up to her and told her that this is what we should do, I do think MJ flips her vote, and I do think her lack of management of MJ is a major issue in her early game here that causes her to lose control. Though, again, I do think she plays week 5 pretty well from the bottom. Again, she kind of goes under the radar, and while Tucker does talk about wanting her as the backup option, does again proceed to backdoor her, which, I mean, does show some unawareness from her end, as she didn't know that was happening. It still is a spot where by the end it ends up being very impressive, and it says that we do end up having T-Core really fight for her to stay and essentially flip the votes to where she would have stayed no matter what the AI Arena result was, which again she ends up winning anyway, but again she would have stayed no matter what that week. Again, very impressive considering she was the backup target for the actual HOH. And I think her overall relationship with T-Core is something I do find very strange on this season, as again they were theoretically very close, though despite that we see Chelsea constantly be very willing to throw T-Core under the bus and go after her, even though I think T-Core was one of the biggest assets for her game. And I do think a lot of it comes from this overall notion of T-Core wanting a woman of color to go on to win the game, which I do think kept T-Core a bit blinded to what Chelsea was doing, but still Chelsea ended up maintaining that relationship for the rest of the game. But beyond that, we get to week 6, which I think is really where Chelsea's game kickstarts, and it really ends up starting her position at the top from really that point forward, where at the beginning of the week, we do see her really solidify this trio with Cam and MJ in a spot where she later makes a final 2 with MJ. And again, I do think her relationship with MJ, I think is probably the best move Chelsea makes across the entire season. The way that she's able to manipulate MJ and have MJ take her to the end, even though again, never felt like Chelsea genuinely liked MJ that much until later in the game, was constantly annoyed by her early on, which is part of the reason why she didn't bother maintaining her relationship with her early on. But she does end up picking pretty much the perfect person to ride the game with, where MJ again is this person that wants 2 women of faith at the end and is very honor bound and constantly talks about religion, where again I think that ends up being the perfect ally for Chelsea here to manipulate. But again, this is where she makes one of the better moves for her across the entire season in taking out Tucker. A move that again I would mostly credit to Chelsea. I think she deserves most of the credit for this move. I think she did a lot of the active work to make this move go through. We do initially see her talk to Cam about it. Cam agrees that they should do it. That she then goes to Leah and MJ, gets them on board. Then she gets Quinn on board. Again, she does a lot of the active work to make this move go through. There again, I think she deserves a lot of credit there. And again, it opens up the game in a way that allows really anyone to take the reins. And again, we see Quinn win the following HOH in a spot where now he could take the reins. He can now control the game. Only for him to mess up, where again, in that spot, he should have been targeting Chelsea and Cam, yet he doesn't. And I think that is again another credit to Chelsea and the fact that again, she had this relationship with Quinn where they had this like mutual understanding about them not going for each other right away. That keeps her safe during this round in a spot where again, she should have been in a spot where she was the optimal target for this round. Now, I will say by the end, I think there's still some rocky play across this week, where obviously this is the week where Joseph goes home. She does want Joseph gone and does campaign for it, though does end up backing down by the end. Kimo was going home, which again is so bad for her game. Keeping in the trio was so beneficial for her. A shield in front of her. Also a trio that was wanting to take her to the end. Also a trio that she could beat in comps, to where again, I think there's no reason for her to get rid of the trio at this point in the game. Yeah, again, she was willing to relent and do so until Kimo's speech and she flips her vote, which again is just so rocky there. I don't really feel like I can give her much credit for the Joseph vote, where it just feels like it happens just completely by accident. But again, it is the right call for her game. Following that, she wins HOH and initially targets Angela, which I think is a fine call for her game, though later the target flips on to Kimo. And she's fine with it, which again, another point in the game where she is initially willing to let go of this person that is very beneficial for her game. Again, she should be keeping the trio around, yet is willing to get rid of one of their members. Only for then Angela to tell her about how Quinn and Leah are working the trio, and that finally springs into her head that, hey, we could just go for Quinn and Leah. So again, she wants to go for Leah, though her alliance members want to go for Quinn. And again, I think from a positioning standpoint, I think Leah is the better call for her. I think she had the right state of mind. But again, she goes through the Quinn move, which is also still pretty good for her. It's not that big of a difference. Though once she makes the Quinn move, she then regrets it and wants to flip the vote back and wavers throughout the entire week on the move. Again, has to be convinced by Cam that this is the move that they should be making. There again, she ultimately makes the move to take out Quinn. Again, a good HOH for her. Probably the one that really sets up the rest of the game, in the sense that at that point, there's very little competition for her moving forward. Then we get the final 8, which I think is probably her sloppiest round of the post-jury, where again, coming into it, it did seem like Leah was targeting her. Again, I think Chelsea was pretty sloppy at the end of last week, blindsiding Leah for no reason. Also made it very aware to Leah that she was contemplating putting her up. Again, all that should have made her the target coming into this week, though. I think this is the week where I don't think she herself does much actively good work, but I do think she pays the dividends of having these good relationships with the likes of Cam and MJ, where Cam and MJ fight for her with Leah, to where it seems like that's what convinces Leah to get off of the Chelsea plan and target the trio instead, which ends up keeping her safe there. But even then, by the end of the week, she ends up losing out on the vote. It's the only point in the end game where she doesn't really get her way. She wants to keep T-Core in the game, fights to get the votes on T-Core, and initially he is able to sway Cam a little bit, though he ends up flipping back. T-Core goes home. Again, I think that is overall, again, a failure on her end. Also beyond that, this is the point where her jealousy of Cam gets really the best of her, and the point where, and she hasn't open fight with him in the backyard and moves her cot away, and again ends up being so preoccupied with this that she stops managing MJ. That allows MJ to gain the traction to pull off the T-Core move, to where again I think this is a very sloppy played week, and a lot of it just seeming to relate back to her jealousy over Cam, which I do think, again, the fact that that can actually influence her game is definitely a negative for her as well. But then we get to the final 7, where again she ends up convincing MJ to take out Leah. I think that is again a very impressive move. A move that, again, MJ had no reason to ever make. And, again, the fact that she was able to get MJ to do it, very, very impressive. And I don't think it really betters her positioning that much, in the sense that, again, Angela and Leah, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Either one is targeting her. Either one can win comps. It doesn't really matter that much. Though, again, it is, again, a move that is very flashy to the jury. I think this is something that actually gains her a lot of credibility with the jury, to the point where I think that ends up making it a very good move by the end of it, where it seems like this really convinces the jury that, oh, it is definitely Chelsea doing these things, not MJ, which, again, I think definitely ruins her game as a whole, even though, again, I think from a pure positioning standpoint, it doesn't really do that much for her. But again, coming into the double, I think she's once again sloppy. She tells Rina that we should be targeting MJ, which obviously she proceeds to not do. Where again, I think targeting Angela was the perfect target for her. But then coming to the final 5 round, obviously this gives ammunition for Rina to go to MJ and tell her about this. Which again, MJ doesn't believe because it's MJ. But again, I think this is, again, another point of sloppy play from Chelsea that could have backfired her on her, but just doesn't. And this is another week where she's able to convince MJ to not take out Cam in a spot where, and she does kind of placate her for a bit, and did seem to be genuinely frustrated at Cam potentially throwing competitions, which is all really dumb. And even by the end of the week, she does waver on her vote. Now, I will say, I actually do think there's an argument for keeping around Kimo for Chelsea, where I don't think this is bad that she's wavering here. As, again, I think keeping around Kimo is a bigger target ahead of you, though I think the worry there is obviously that Cam and Kimo seem to be very chummy, to where maybe Cam picks Kimo over you. So again, I can see the pros and cons of that move, though, and at the end of the day, she ends up flipping back anyway. Final 4, again, does a lot of good work. I think, again, some of the best work she does all season, convincing MJ to keep around Cam over Rina, which is purely insane, as again, that is such a bad move for MJ. Yeah, again, she's able to convince her there, and obviously convinces MJ to take her to final 2, which to be fair was never really in doubt, but again, just pure insanity considering she beats MJ at the end. Now, again, I think there's qualms in the fact that supposedly Chelsea thought she was going to lose 4-3 against MJ, and still talks about how she would have taken MJ, which again, I don't love that, but even within that, she for some reason promises Cam that she's going to take him to the end, in a spot where she has no reason to do so, and again, that just opens it up for Cam going to MJ and telling her about it, and again, it's MJ, so it won't matter, but again, it's still sloppy play. Outside of that, again, I do think Chelsea's endgame there is particularly strong. Again, I don't think there was really any doubt that she was going to win. I think she wins against pretty much anybody in the endgame outside of maybe Kimo. So again, I think a very impressive game by the end. To where again, as a whole, Chelsea's game, very impressive. One of the most dominant games of all time. Though again, with every 2 steps forward, it feels like there's a step back, to where, again, I think that's my major qualm with her in general, is that I do feel like there are many points where I just disagree for all decision making. So again, that's what makes it very difficult to rank her as a player in the grand scheme of things. Though obviously on this specific player ranking, again, it's not close. She's number 1 by a lot. I mean, on my presumed player ranking, she's higher than Cam by at least 60 spots. So again, it is a very wide margin, to where I do think Chelsea is a player that, again, played a very dominant game, was able to cultivate these very strong relationships, was able to get those people towards the end. But again, I think my one hesitancy is the fact that I just don't know how much faith I have in her overall strategic decision making. Where again, she very much wavers on decisions constantly. She also sloppily leaks information at points, to where while I do think she gets back on track and none of the things that she does poorly ends up backfiring on her, I still think that the fact that those red flags are there, something that again keeps her out of the truly elite players of all time. Though again, in terms of winning game, it's one of the best we've ever seen, one of the most dominant performances ever, and that's why she's here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Big Brother 26, the end of my BB26 coverage. Now down the road, again, I'm sure there'll be more Big Brother videos here and there. I know I have some other videos planned for sometime next year, and I'm probably going to try to do more Big Brother videos during the Big Brother season next year. So again, that'll be something, and obviously I'll be back for BB27, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.